just delighted to be here. I usually call myself a PK. My father was a priest, but he was also an academic or a dean, so I guess I could be a DK. And when I was in the dean's residence last night, I spoke to the dean and said, oh, I remember these kinds of parties where the house had to all of a sudden be made ready and the kids were told, don't be going into the part of the house because mom and dad are having a party. So very nice to be part of an academic gathering, though, I've got to say. A really lovely opportunity for me to hear from you and to learn all the different things that you're struggling with, but also how unbelievably resonant it all is. I feel like we're all having the same conversation in different contexts with different aspects, but it's really all the same conversation, which is about the relationship between place and people and how we actually maximize and optimize for both, for the place and for the people. And I said to the guys at the desk there, I read that booklet, the report, the 2021 report that you put out in bed last night, and was just struck again by how remarkable a difference individuals can make. And I just want to echo my colleagues' comments about the nobleness of the public health mandate of a public health school. We're all public. We should all be about public health. And whenever I go into any city and look at any situation around urban life, I always look to see what is the public health department doing. Because all the great urban innovation that we have historically generally has come from a public health practitioner of some kind. And so to make this more general, and for us to understand that actually we're all in this business of promoting public health, that back to that people-place connection, is really valuable for me to be reminded of and for me to just witness it in your presence. So I'll blow through some slides really quickly, but I also just want to say that in Canada, where I live in Toronto, I'm a dual citizen, and I was in a number of American cities, and Andre Perry and I are old colleagues from New Orleans. In Canada, we always start meetings by doing a land acknowledgement, and where we talk about the ancestral territory that we occupy. So I'll just do that for you in terms of where we are in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Wendat, the Chippewa, and the Anishinaabe. And we have, Toronto is a very, very multiculturally diverse city, but it also is the ancestral home for Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. And part of what we have to come to terms with as urbanists, and what Arthur just reinforced, is that historically, urban planning has been extraordinarily exclusionary and has, in fact, reinforced systemic barriers and racialized practices and all the things that American cities are very clear on, and at least we're clear that they exist. I don't know if we're as clear as we need to be about how we dismantle them and how we're perpetuating them. And in Canadian cities which are younger, we have our own, younger in terms of settlers, we have our own versions of this. So I feel like we always have to just check ourselves in terms of what the reality is in terms of our ancestral histories, but in terms of our current practice as well. So, not dissimilar to Barbara's comments about what are we going to learn, I have started to talk in Canada about what's the COVID dividend. We had a lot of things that we had to rapidly do, and we were able to do them to make life more livable, to protect people, to support people. And as we hit, believe it or not, December 7 is COVID 1000. And as we hit that, are we going to think carefully about, boy, it's a very lovely reveal there, how quickly that takes. We started, are we going to be able to harvest the best of what we did well and get it to stick, as opposed to reverting? And actually, we were having a conversation over breakfast about how the tendency, to regress to the mean is even worse, that we're kind of going to swing back to the way it was, whatever normal was, and we will miss the opportunity to have the kind of seminal change that we know we need to do. So at CUI, we started, believe it or not, we started writing reports at COVID 100, and then COVID 200, and COVID 300, and then we did one at 365 days of COVID. We were using the WHO declaration date. And at 365, we were exhausted and thought we were done. We just all thought, didn't we all think that? We all thought we'd lock down for 2 months and then life would go back. When we were at the year mark, we started to see the same kinds of patterns that you've already identified, that all the things that were dysfunctional in urban environments were just exacerbated, made worse, made much more visible by where COVID was actually manifesting and where the risks were the greatest. So we've decided to take this December date on the 7th and mark COVID 1000 and ask ourselves, what are the COVID dividends? So one of the things that we did through COVID was we put up a participatory crowdsourcing platform called CityShare, where we asked people just to put some stuff down that's working well in your community. We have over 1,000 entries there of community-based responses, mutual aid, delivery services, different ways of offering public supports, all the different ways at the ground level of how people improvised. And what we're finding now, which my colleagues are all reinforcing, is that we have some really fundamental choices to make about the future of urban life and future of cities. And the challenges aren't new in many cases, but they were made much more visible. So for us in Canada, for instance, one of the great challenges, obviously, is the economic impact that our downtowns and our main streets have been virtually abandoned. Canada had some of the jurisdictions with some of the longest lockdowns, and so that has meant the work from home pattern for people that could, or the other kinds of challenges that were on essential workers and essential services, the people aren't using those services. So our transit systems in Canada operating much, much lower. That means has a significant impact on the fiscal health of the municipality that depends on transit revenue. I can see Arthur nodding his head. It's had enormous impacts on independent businesses. I'm very interested, Barbara, during the panel, we can talk about factories, but also mom and pop businesses, as we used to call them, often run by immigrants or newcomers on main streets. In Canada, they were propped up for a period of time. There were wage subsidy programs and rental relief programs. All of that has expired now. And so if you're in a downtown or if you're on a main street in any of Canada's major cities, it's worse in certain ones than others, you will see boarded up shops. You will see signs that people can't get staff. And of course, we have dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of empty office floors. Dozens. So for us, the Canadian GDP is largely generated from the urban environments. To try to make that case in a country that is organized historically, not dissimilar to the United States, with a kind of representation around geography, which means that there is no urban real political power. It is dispersed so that you can have a local Canadian member of parliament that represents 60,000 people, and you can have another one that's representing 6.5 million. It's tipped away from urban, and we have a narrative in Canada that isn't particularly urban. So it's really interesting to see how we can actually tip solution finding to focus on where we have congregate environments where people are living together, working together in denser environments. And from the climate's perspective, that has to be the future, but we have to run against a political grain that isn't that. So this piece about the dividend for me is this, and we were just talking a little bit about that. We've had seminal moments in urban life historically, and it was often your constituency, public health, that stepped in and said, wait a second, this led to that crisis. Out of it, we're going to manage wastewater differently. We're going to manage building codes differently, or we're going to do coastal protection differently. So that, for me, is the question we all have to sort of focus on. Of all these things, and some of them are trivial, and there was a lot of pushback in Canadian cities about patios and bike lanes, and basically it was just accommodating white people. But I think there are more fundamental things that were broader benefits to broader populations that we need to find how do we make them actually stick. So which of these measures that were ad hoc that we were suddenly able to do that everyone told us we could never do, which should stick? What are the lasting ones we need to do now? What is the future of density? What's the future of co-location? What's the future of transit-oriented development? What's the future of affordable housing? What's the future of land use? Where's placemaking fit in all of this? How are we going to actually summon a kind of collective wisdom to make, in our case at CUI, we focused on main streets and downtowns. Where are faith institutions? Where are our social mutual aid organizations? Where's digital media? Where are libraries? All the things that help us bind and create connective tissue. How do we invest in them? And how do we leverage it to create the cities we want? So we're trying to build a very broad alliance in Canada. Industry, private sector, labor, civil society, academia, all the different constituencies that actually care about a city. A city is not just the local government, it's all of us. How do you actually put them together in as broad a kind of constituency you can, but still have an action focus? So we've got 4 areas of concern, as I suggested, all of which challenged considerably. Rebuilding downtowns and main streets, mental health and homeless, I'm done. Infrastructure, transit, and climate action, and then how do you actually drive development from the base up? So our goal is this, to see if we can actually position Canadian cities as leaders in urban sustainability, and I feel like that is the collective challenge, that we've got this moment. I saw the mayor's comment, can we meet the Boston moment? I think we have a global moment for cities. Thanks.